Welcome to God is Open. I am your host, Christopher Fisher. Today on God is Open, we're going to be covering a sermon by Dr. James Dolezal. And this is an interesting guy. I bought one of his books, and he is really interested in the very meticulous details of metaphysics. And so he's not like your normal Calvinist. He's not like your normal Arminian who uses words like knowledge, and then they kind of, use alternative definitions, and the audience doesn't quite know what they actually mean when they're using those words. But this guy cares. This guy's very academic in his treatment of God's attributes, and that's what I like about him. His face value, he's being honest, he's being straightforward, he defines what he means, he explains it in detail, and he's a negative theologian, don't get me wrong. It's pure Platonism, which he talks about, but he cares about it enough to explain it accurately. And I like the guy. He's very charismatic. You watch his videos on YouTube, and he seems like a genuine guy. And I suspect if I ever had him as a guest on this podcast, we'd have a very amiable conversation. We'd probably talk about what exactly it means, God's omniscience. And he would be straightforward and say exactly the things that I've been saying about how they take God's knowledge. People might think I'm just making it up or whatever. Oh, they don't think God's knowledge is pure actuality, identical to his self-being. Well, yeah, that's what they believe. And this guy, he actually points it out. This is the guy also quoted on immutability. Remember that Calvinist podcast that, what was it? It was something where the guy, he said that, open theists say that, that Calvinists don't think God actually has emotions. And this guy's a Calvinist, this James Dolezal, and in his podcast, in one of his interviews about God's immutability, he's like, yeah, God doesn't actually have actual emotions. And so it's funny. So you got these lightweight Calvinists who don't know what the heck they're talking about. They don't understand their own metaphysics. And then you got people like James Dolezal. So I like him. I think he's a worthwhile to quote and to listen to, and he's a pretty good authority on the subject of metaphysics. But with that being stated, it's not biblical theology, and we'll kind of see how he uses the Bible, and he uses it in it's kind of a forced manner, and that's what you'd expect people coming to the Bible with their negative theology. And of course, by negative theology, we mean theology that distances God from creation, that God cannot be related to creation. It's negative theology. God is only spoken about in abstracts because he's incomprehensible and infinite. And you'll kind of hear some of these themes in this sermon. We're not going to be able to cover all the sermon today, but we'll go as far as we can and just see what he says and how he says it.
We've been touching on in Sunday school, and this morning, the last couple of times we've talked about God's eternity and his omnipresence. Today I want us to consider the doctrine of God's omniscience. I'll take just as a text for a point of departure Psalm 147:5, where we read these words: "Great is our Lord and abundant in strength. His understanding is infinite," or more literally, innumerable, without number. It's not quantifiable. So when we say that God is omniscient, we don't mean that there's this vast sum of knowledge that God has.
All right, so let's talk real quick about his proof text. And he's talking about God's understanding is infinite. And in the ancient world, gods had to have various attributes in order to function. Knowledge was one of those attributes. And understanding, ability to process that knowledge, that's a separate attribute. They're not the same things. And so this is not quite an omniscience proof text. It's not talking about the extent of God's knowledge. This is talking about how God processes and understands and uses his knowledge. That's what this is about. And contextually, it says his knowledge is infinite. Yeah, and sure, it's kind of like a hyperbolic number. And the same wording is used for the amount of grain that Joseph collects for Pharaoh. This is not like an incomprehensible number of grain. Well, we might not be able to count it very well because grain's kind of small and you see a ton of grain coming in. So it's like, well, that's just like an infinite, countless amount of grain. But you can't just assume the metaphysics onto this infinite understanding. You can't assume perfection, pure actuality that is in no way related, size, shape, or form to man, how man understands stuff. You just don't get that from the verse. You don't get that from the context. And it very well could be used in the same hyperbolic sense that Joseph collects the grain. And remember, people interact with God in the Bible. And often the outcome is favorable towards man. And, God says, okay, you got a good point. So what are we talking about here? Does this verse mean quite how he uses it? And he'll go on. He's just adding this as an intro, trying to pique people's interest, and his assumptions on this verse are very forced.
What we mean is that God's knowledge is not the kind of thing that is susceptible to enumeration. Okay, so NASB renders it sort of idiomatically, his understanding is infinite, which I think is actually getting at the sense of it, which is to say there's an unboundedness in his knowing. Confession chapter.
So that wasn't a textual analysis. That was James Dolezal saying this is what God should be like, and here's a verse, and here's how I think this verse should best be read to conform with my image of what God should be like. It's not a context-driven interpretation, and he might even admit that if we had him on and talked to him about how he gets his theology from these verses. He might admit it's not contextual; it has to be assumed out of the text. But see how he uses omniscience. Omniscience isn't just a sum total of knowledge. It's not like I have all these facts in my head and man has facts in their head, but it's just not the same number of facts that God has in his head. So James Dolezal says it's not that type of knowledge. You're not comparing that type of knowledge to God's knowledge. God's knowledge is not innumerable. God's knowledge is infinite. God's knowledge is identical to his being, and it's this wholly other type of knowledge. It's not comparable with how we know stuff.
2, both paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 have something to say about God's knowledge. This is page 671 in the back of the hymnal if you want to see what I'm looking at. Let me read the first half of chapter or of section 1, and then I'll read at least section 2 up to the point on knowledge. The Lord our God is but one only living and true God, whose subsistence is in and of himself, infinite in being and perfection. Let's just let that kind of frame what we're going to say. We're going to say some things about different attributes, but infinite in being and perfection, whatever it is for God to have these attributes, it's not in the manner that finite things have them. He goes on, whose essence cannot be comprehended by any but himself. So we begin, if I can say, this is the first statement about God's knowledge in Confession chapter 2, and it's a statement about his self-knowledge, a statement about his own self-comprehension. When we talked about incomprehensibility some time back, we made the point that when we say incomprehensibility, we don't mean in an absolute sense. We mean incomprehensible to the creature, incomprehensible to all who are not God, but comprehensible to himself, of course. God's knowledge is as deep in God as God's being. We'll talk about that a little bit later.
So what he's quoting here is, it looks like the 1689 Baptist Confession, chapter 2, and that's where he's getting all this stuff. So this is not like an early Christian document from the first century. It's these confessions that were made up by men well after the time of Jesus about concerns that aren't at all biblical and just completely foreign to the Bible. It's interesting. He treats it as authoritative. And yeah, I understand. It fits the theology he likes, and he likes how his metaphysics it works together, and he's created a system in his mind that works. And, I could understand his attachment to that, and I don't fault him for that. Just his misuse of verses to to proof text his theology. That's where I would be taking issue.
So we first begin with God's knowledge of self-comprehension. Infinite knowledge knows infinite being. It goes on, a most pure spirit, invisible, without body, parts, or passions, who only hath immortality, dwelling in the light, into which no man can approach unto, who is immutable, immense, eternal, incomprehensible, almighty, every way infinite. Infinity and incomprehensibility just keep sort of poking their heads up, as you go through the confession, again, reminding you, so you never get too far away from that. Most holy, and then this statement with regard to his knowledge, most wise, most free, most absolute. Then it goes on to talk about the counsel of his will. Down to section 2, God having all life, glory, goodness, blessedness in and of himself, is alone in and unto himself all sufficient, not standing in need of any creature he hath made, nor deriving any glory from them, but only manifesting his glory in, by, unto, and upon them.
Yeah, does that sound biblical? It doesn't sound biblical to me. In the Psalms, people bargain with God. They say, if you save me alive, I will glorify you, right? God gets things from people. And there's an interaction. God brings the animals to Adam to see what he would call them. God's gaining knowledge, and he's satisfying curiosity. And really, everything that we just read there from that Baptist confession is just Platonism. It's this idea that God has to be wholly other, and he's incomprehensible, and he's pure actuality and immutable in his essence. He can't change or do anything, and it's the Platonic dissension. It's the Platonic outlook of the world. And remember, this was pretty vogue right after the time of Christ. So it's just interesting how the two, Christianity and Platonism, melded, because nothing that you're hearing here is biblical. It's not found in the Bible, and the proof text they have, like he stated earlier, nothing in the context explains how that meets his definition of immutability, all his metaphysics, and you have to point to these really strange doctrines and works that are outside of the Bible, outside of the time frame where the biblical authors read or would be able to give direct input onto these people who are shaping Christianity. It's just weird to me how this is where Christianity is. This is the state of Christianity that we're believing in these. You're believing that the Bible has these weird claims in it. It doesn't.
I know that's a mouthful, but basically, all that God is in himself, he is by virtue of himself. So that whatever is in God is not the consequent of something acting on God, but rather all that is in God is because of God's godness.
Right, so that applies to everything, even God's knowledge. We can't give God knowledge. Like when the Psalms describe God in heaven watching the actions of man, God can't actually be in heaven gaining knowledge. Any gain of knowledge would defy his immutable, perfect perfection essence. And there can be no changes, no affection of creatures towards God. The creatures cannot affect God. God cannot be changed or influenced by the outside. God can't revel in glory that creatures give him. God cannot be affected and is in and of himself a perfect, divine, pure essence that can't change.
So when we say, I think we talked about, if not formally, we have at least alluded to it, this doctrine of aseity, that God is ase, he is of himself. So anything we say God is ultimately explained in terms of God's own godness, not in terms of something else that's causing or moving him to that being. And then he talks about creatures. Well, what about giving God glory? Doesn't he get that from us? And so it attacks that first and says, no. In fact, when we glorify God, we don't give to him a glory he lacked prior to our glorifying him. Our glorifying him is more like reflecting and broadcasting, not adding or giving newness to. So he manifests his glory upon them, he alone being the fountain of all being, of whom, through whom, and to whom are all things, taken from Romans 11:36. He hath most sovereign.
Yeah, is that what it means? That pure actuality, pure aseity, God can't be affected by anything. Is that what that means? Or are there better ways to take that? That's not negative theology, right?
Sovereign dominion over all creatures, to do by them, for them, and upon them whatsoever he pleaseth. And then it gets into this, and then it drills more deeply into this whole thing of knowledge. And
Yes, it sounds more like a kingship proof text to me rather than pure actuality, infinite nature. Their proof texts don't really line up to what they're trying to prove. They're trying to prove too much with too little.
We'll get into some text in a few moments. It says, in his sight, all things are open and manifest. And you can probably think of some texts. We'll look at a couple in a second. Psalm 139, to be sure, would be a text that says this. Hebrews 4, among others, talk about God. Nothing is in the dark with respect to God. Everything, so far as it stands before God, is done in the light of day, in full exposure.
Except for things can't stand before God because things can't affect God. And so maybe you might want to rephrase that a little bit. The knowledge that God has is inherent in his being and identical to his essence and existed long before anything else existed timelessly with God in this other realm, this realm of the one in the Platonism, right? That's the realm of the one. And so, some of his language could be changed a little bit to closer mirror his actual beliefs. Nothing stands before God. Nothing's open before God. The knowledge can't affect God. So you can't stand open before God, can you? Because that would be a relationship to God, and we can't do that. We can't put a relationship with God.
Then the confession does something interesting, and it says a few perhaps challenging things about God's knowledge. It gets into this question of not just what God knows. And when we talk about omniscience, everyone who affirms omniscience is willing to ascribe some kind of indescribable scope to God's knowledge. But the confession, the next statement that it makes, is not so much talking about scope in terms of how much God knows. It makes a statement about how God knows. The way in which he knows. So
that's very, very important, very important. And we try to stress that on this podcast because often in the Bible, not only will it talk about what God knows, but also talk about how he knows it. And so let's see what he says here. And he's going to get to the core of the issue, an issue that I have with a lot of Calvinists. They don't think about the attributes that they ascribe to God. They don't think about the mechanics of how it works, and they want their cake and to eat it too.
The interest here in this next phrase is not so much with the breadth of his knowledge, so to speak, but with the manner of his knowing. And so it says, his knowledge is infinite, infallible, and independent upon the creature. It's a little strange, this independent upon the creature. So he knows the creature, but he doesn't depend upon the creature for his knowing. Okay? That just isn't said. We can't say that about anyone else. So the manner of his knowing is independent. It's like the manner of his being. It's a se. Infinite, infallible, independent upon the creature, so as nothing is to him contingent or uncertain, because there's nothing that lies, as it were, in the shadowy periphery of God's knowledge. There's not that unaccounted for thing. And part of the reason for this is because God isn't actually getting his knowledge of creatures from creatures. Now, this is going to...
See, yeah, check that out. That's exactly what I've been saying.
Let me just throw this out there in case it's already popped in your head. This is going to challenge us somewhat with the way in which we have to handle the ordinary talk of the Bible when it talks about God as perceiving, hearing, discovering, finding out, remembering, saying things like, now I know. Did he not know previous? Is this a new knowledge?
Yeah. That's what the point of the text is.
So there's a sense in which if we can biblically establish that the confession is right when it says that God's knowledge is independent upon the creature, why does the Bible so often and prolifically talk about God's knowledge like it is dependent upon the creature?
That's a good question.
Right? I think this is the confession gives us a lot to work on in terms of how we're going to interpret and handle Scripture. And is this anthropomorphic talk? And if it's anthropomorphic, is it not telling us and revealing to us something true about God and His knowledge, even if under a form or a mode of learning that isn't proper to Him? That kind of thing. We'll drill. I don't promise to answer all.
Yeah, you see why I like this guy? I like this guy.
Questions on that, but at least just to explore how we might handle a few of those. Good, and then it goes back to his counsel and his works, so we'll leave it with that. So we talk about both that God is all-wise. God's first and primary act of knowledge is an act of self-knowledge, comprehending his own self, and then knowing everything else infinitely, infallibly, independently of those things. What is that kind of knowledge? We'll get into a bit of that. All right, so just letting that kind of get a few categories floating around before we put them in place. Wilhelmus of Brockel says this in his very brief definition of the knowledge of God. And if you know these Sunday school classes, I'm often referring to Wilhelmus of Brockel, and I'm not saying you must, but the only book you must read is the Bible. But if you want to do,
that'd be so funny. If this guy only had the Bible his entire life, nothing that he's taught today would be like on his mind. He wouldn't have any of these ideas. And it's all extra biblical philosophy that he's bringing to the text that you can nowhere assume out of the text of the Bible. Maybe you could. There's a lot of weird cults going around claiming strange things in the Bible, but normal reading comprehension would show nothing what he's talking about is described in the Bible.
Do something useful in terms of your reading. It's kind of ambitious and it's big, but any time spent in Wilhelmus of Brockel's volumes, The Christian's Reasonable Service, is time well spent. He's very careful and precise. He says, the knowledge of God neither has its origin in the creature, nor does it flow from the creature to God. Rather, it flows from God himself to the creature.
Yeah, it's everything I've been saying. Every time I talk about omniscience, this is the type of omniscience that Calvinism requires. Knowledge that is inherent in God's essence and it can't flow from the creature to God, or else God would not be immutable. His knowledge would be dependent. He would create relationships, and that challenges God's infinite nature.
This is basically what our confession says when it says it's independent upon the creature. If we were to define the doctrine of divine knowledge, and we can say omniscience, and that's a word that maybe we're more familiar with, but let's just call this the doctrine of divine knowledge. God's knowledge is that perfection by which God, in an entirely unique manner, in a way of knowing that is for God alone, in an entirely unique manner, knows himself and all things possible and actual in one simple and eternal act. I know that's a mouthful, but I try to get it all. On my paper, it's less than 2 full lines, so I felt like that was fair. The perfection by which God, in an entirely unique manner, knows himself and all things possible and actual in one simple and eternal act.
I would love that if Calvinists started using that as their default definition of what they mean by omniscience, because none of the proof texts talk to that. And, that's every single little detail they add like that. They do this Mote and Bailey thing. If you're familiar with the Mote and Bailey argument, it's like you make these broad, absurd claims, and then when it's challenged, you retreat back to a more defensible claim. So they'll say, God's knowledge is pure perfection, and he can't be influenced by his creatures and gain knowledge from observation and stuff like that. And so then someone will say, well, the Bible doesn't have that. And they'll jump back to these proof texts and say, see, these proof texts show God's omniscience, that God knows all things. Well, that's not the claim that you were making. You're trying to defend a more defensible claim about the overall scope of God's knowledge, but your real claims are a lot larger than that. So try to defend your larger claims. And a lot of people, they don't do that. I don't know if this guy does. This is my first time listening to this, so I'm listening to this with you. And so far, it's pretty good. And this guy, I would listen if you're interested in this type of stuff. negative theology, this is your go-to guy for it. All his sermons, his books, they're very detailed, and it's pretty mainstream understanding of metaphysics. And if they say that this guy's wrong, Calvinists don't understand their own theology. This is the legit stuff here.
Maybe just quickly say, that what we mean is then when we speak of God's knowledge, we're not talking about an acquired kind of knowledge. We're not talking about learning. We're not talking about a syllogism that God thinks through. God doesn't work his way from major premises through a series of minor premises to conclusions. God doesn't get to the end of knowledge having begun without it. Okay, I always like to say, yes, we are to imitate God and to be like God. And then when I tell my students, God doesn't think through things. They think, good, I'm off the hook.
How do you imitate a perfection, immutable being that has no desires and no parts and is pure simplicity? I could do maybe like watching a really terrible Netflix show. Maybe that might do. Maybe watching like a Amy Schumer comedy routine where you're sitting there like a dense rock, just absorbing this just utter garbage, and nothing can be acted on you, and you're in like comatose. Maybe that is imitating this pure simplicity, immutability. But it's funny. People are like, "Oh, Jesus is God," but God is immutable, pure simplicity. And if you look at Jesus, you see God. Well, in what way? In what way, when you look at Jesus, do you see God? In your weird theology. And I legit had a Calvinist say, I don't know. I don't know how Jesus could say, if you see me, then you see the Father, because nothing. There's no commonalities between what this guy's talking about God and Jesus that we see in the Bible. There's no commonalities.
Okay, that's not what we mean when we say that we're to imitate God. We're not imitating infinity. We're imitating in that creaturely way those virtues of God's perfection and excellence. All right, we already started with a brief look at the Psalm 147:5 passage. If you want sort of a good solid proof text for omniscience, I would say Psalm 147:5 is a great place to go. 1 John 3:20, starting in verse 19. We will know by this that we are of the truth and will assure our heart before him. And whatever our heart condemns us, for God is greater than our heart. And then it says, and knows all things. God is greater than our heart and knows all things. In this case, of course, the thing he knows perfectly is you.
So stop the tape. Stop the tape. Okay. So God knows all things. So does that prove exactly what he just talked to us about, perfect omniscience, where God can't gain any information from any sort of possible way, and it's pure perfection, and it's a once act that's timeless in essence and internally derived? Does that proof text prove that? Guess what? Guess who else was said to know all things? Jesus was. Even though Jesus didn't know the time and the day, Mark 13:36, he doesn't know the time of the day of the return. What this language is, when it's used, we see plenty of examples of it being hyperbolic. King David is said to know all things. And so there's good precedence that it doesn't mean perfect Platonistic metaphysics. It doesn't mean Platonistic omniscience that's pure act and identical to God's essence. There's nothing in context that suggests that. And we have plenty of other contexts that show that it's not used in that type of way. So my problem with what he's saying here is his proof texts are kind of contrived. There's nothing in the immediate context that supports his take on this. It's not a good proof text for what he's trying to prove. It would be a good proof text for the open theists, their idea that God generally knows everything that happens on earth, and this general knowledge is used throughout the Bible. King David is said to know all things. The king of Tyre says to know all secrets of the heart. And how do you distinguish? How do you distinguish in First John what type of knowledge it's talking about, or are you just assuming it? And if you're assuming it, why are you using it as your proof text? The only conceivable reason is you're desperate for proof text, and this best fits what you're trying to force into the text. And it's pretty bad at that. So it just tells you that they don't have actual biblical support when their proof texts are this poor.
So that we tend to think that we know ourselves better than anyone else knows us, and there's a truth to that. Proverbs says the heart of man is deep, is like deep waters, and only a wise man can pull out what is deep in the heart of man.
So he referenced Psalms 139 earlier in this sermon, and towards the end of it, King David says, "Try my heart and know if there's any evil in me." And throughout the Bible, we have this consistent testing of hearts. God tests to see. And that's how he knows what's in the heart. This verse in 1 John, it doesn't necessarily mean that he just has this inherent knowledge from all eternity of everyone's hearts. I don't think 1 John is contradicting King David in Psalms 139, how King David says that God knows the hearts through testing. I don't think that it's like that. I think 1 John is more likely to be drawing on this Old Testament concept that God tests the hearts to know the hearts. And, even if we're denying ourselves, God knows the hearts because he's done these tests in order to know that. I think that's a more probable explanation of what's going on here than this absolute Platonic metaphysics it's not described in these verses. So where do you get off using this as your proof text? I don't see where the context even supports your ideas.
Man can be an enigma to himself. Now you know more about yourself than the rest of us. You've got stuff in the basement, so to speak, that is there and we don't. Okay?
So let's talk about the Gulag Archipelago. I've been reading this book, and this book is about this in Soviet Russia. They murdered upwards of 60 million of their own people. That's a lot of people. And Jordan Peterson, he's a professor of philosophy, and he references this book often. And I'm a fan of him as well. But one thing he tries to teach his students is that if they lived in Nazi Germany or in Soviet Russia, they would have been collaborators, even though they might not think that's how they would have acted. And there's also an abortion video that put out by, I believe, Ray Comfort that quizzes Americans on, how far would you go? Would you drive the truck that goes over the bodies, that buries the people alive? It explores these things. But so sometimes people, and they of course, they don't know the own depths of what they are capable of. But believe you me, if you were in communist Russia, and it's a secret state society when everyone's informing on each other, and no one's rising up, and everyone's hiding in their rooms, and they're afraid of being condemned themselves, and just millions of people are being drug out into the streets. They're shot. They're thrown in gulags. They're just eliminated. There's massive torture. Go on YouTube and Google the Gulag Archipelago, and there's an audiobook of this book, and it's horrific. And one of the things the author tries to point out is that any one of us could have been those torturers. Any one of us could have been those people interviewing. He talks about how the absolute power corrupts. He talks about how the system corrupts individuals. And we also talked earlier on this podcast, in a previous podcast, about The Censors, which was a fictional story, but it explored these same themes. And so, yeah, we might not know ourselves as well as other people know the capabilities of human beings, what human beings would do. And I am apt to say that most Americans don't understand human nature. They don't understand how reality works, and they don't understand what they're truly capable of in different circumstances. They would have been the Nazis. They would have been the Soviet informants, the Soviet torturers, just in Pol Pot's regime in Maoist China, they would have been murdering other people. It's human nature. So what's he trying to say? James Dolezal, he's trying to say that we know ourselves better than anyone else. I don't think so. I think your point's a little lost on me.
So there's a sense in which you have a kind of privileged access to the knowledge of yourself. But there's still, and I'll talk about this in a few moments, but there's still a sense in which you are a great mystery even to yourself, an enigma to yourself. And this is due to two things. It can be due maybe obviously to sin, which obscures our knowledge, which plunges us into a kind of darkness and a self-unawareness that makes us tell ourselves lies about ourselves in order to excuse ourselves.
All right, so he's picking up on that. I might have been a little too critical earlier on. Of course, this is my first time listening to this podcast with you. I might have been overly critical. He might be getting the point.
I mean, so sin can obviously obscure and darken our self-knowledge, but also finitude does this. Even if there had, I know it's always dangerous to talk about if there had been no fall and theorize about what it would have been like, but I'm going to do it anyway. If there had been no fall, you would still be a finite knower. You would still be one who would have to learn and acquire knowledge of the amazing yet finite world that God created, even the complexities of your own self. Adam, prior to the fall, did not have, I want to conjecture, did not have a perfect knowledge even of, like, say, anatomy and physiology. Are we to think that Adam, before the fall, knew what the appendix was for? And we're only just now, only in the last 10 or 20 years actually getting some scientific theories that might be plausible on what the function of the appendix is in your, that thing that looks like a red hot chili pepper and sometimes gets inflamed and you got to get it out. Okay, are we to think that prior to the fall, Adam had perfect self-knowledge, therefore he understood the why and the wherefore of everything, including his own body? So there's a sense in which when we say that God knows, that we know our hearts, but that God is greater than our hearts and knows all things, even that thing to which you have most privileged access, your own...
Not most privileged access, right? So I think people who are pretty fluent in history might have a better access to the depths of your heart than you might. I'm just throwing out that out there as a possibility.
Even here, God's knowledge, if I can say it this way, God's knowledge puts your knowledge in the shade. His is all light. Yours is still that admixture of light and darkness.
Yeah, so let's just assume everything he said is true. Does that prove eternal knowledge in one act from this divine simplicity from all eternity? It does nothing of the sort. It has nothing to do with future omniscience of all things. It's just a present knowledge of the heart is being described, and it doesn't describe the mechanisms how God knows what he knows. And if we're going to be using the biblical evidence and the biblical witness as precedents for this type of knowledge, it'd be through testing. But he's not going to explore that because he either is unaware of it, and often people, when they're so stuck in their own theology and their worldviews that they build up, they don't explore other possibilities and probabilities, and they see their system, they like their system, and it's almost like a cognitive dissonance where they want to just gloss over things that will throw a wrench into their system.
Elihu, you know that he's one of my favorite Doctrine of God theologians.
Oh, no. Oh. Okay, he's a bad guy. He is a bad guy. All Job's friends are bad guys, and Elihu is just like a mini-me of the other three Job's friends. And a lot of people talk about Elihu as he's in a later addition to the text, and it might be misplaced in the text of Job, but he's never confirmed as having correct theology, and he's still blaming Job, and his doctrine's all bad. It's just echoing his friends, and God condemns the other friends, and Elihu's just ignored in the text besides Elihu's own speech. So, this is your favorite guy. if you're gonna pick, let's say at random, you're gonna pick someone's narrative out of all of Job that you're gonna identify with, the safest one is going to be Job, right? Yeah, because God talks that Job spoke of God what is right, unlike the friends. Job's the only one that gets positive affirmation. Of course, God says that Job is speaking without knowledge, but that's not saying what he's claiming is incorrect. It's probably more of he doesn't have the standing to comment on the events that are happening. And so, don't identify with Elihu. Don't do it.
Because I find myself increasingly going to Elihu. Maybe it's just the poetic form of that part of Job.
Don't do it. Don't do it.
Job, that just allows the statements to be so pithy and to the point.
And note in Job, none of these people in Job are negative theologians. Yeah, you got the Calvinists that everything happens for a reason, and you must have sinned, and so what's happening is a result of your sin, and they're just like the Pharisees that approached Jesus. But none of these guys, when it boils down to it, none of them were negative theologians. God is timeless, eternal, outside of time, and pure actuality, and he's just, everything that happens has been eternally fated from before time even began. None of them are like that. Even though the friends are a little bit more Calvinistic than Job, none of them have that perception of God. All their perception of God is God responds in real time as events happen. So that's just an aside.
Job 37, verse 16. I'll start up a couple verses, verse 14. Listen to this, O Job. Stand and consider the wonders of God. Do you know how God establishes them and makes the lightning of his cloud to shine? Do you know about the layers of the thick clouds? And then it says, the wonders of the one perfect in knowledge. The wonders of the one perfect in knowledge.
What? Okay, perfect in knowledge. So here's a thing to do. And if you don't have eSword, download it. And what eSword does is it gives you like a King James, and it gives you this word searches. And so I'll throw a Hebrew word out there, and you could say, oh, perfect in knowledge. Let's see how this word is used in the Old Testament. And you'll click there. Oh, so Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Oh, Noah's perfect. So words aren't consistently used where everywhere they're used they have to mean a certain things, but anywhere they are used, the way it's being used in that context is a possibility for the way it's being used somewhere else. So you see how that works, that language is flexible in that words can be used in multiple ways in different contexts. So just assuming hard-headedly one definition of a word onto your context, that it's a ridiculous way to do theology, to read the Bible, to read any literature really, because language doesn't work like that. And so in the same way that Noah is perfect, God could be perfect in knowledge. That's one possibility of this text. So is he going to show from the context that this perfection of knowledge is this immutable, eternal, unchanging, can't be affected from outside? Or is he just going to see the word he likes and he says, perfect, I like that word perfect, that's a good work, it makes me feel good inside, and my theology is all about perfect being, and I got this conception in my head of what the perfect God looks like, and so I like that word, and so I'll just expropriate, repurpose this verse for my theology, even though there's nothing in context that suggests my reading is even a possible reading. Is the word used that way definitively in any context within the Bible for this metaphysical absolute anywhere? Oh, I don't think so. So they're inventing a new meaning that they can't point to any context in which the word's actually used that way. But real quick, we're getting probably towards the end of our podcast. We'll hear his point out and see if he addresses my my textual criticism. I'm criticizing his use of language and his use of biblical context and his disuse of the context. He's not considering how things possibly are actually being used. He's assuming his theology onto the text.
I like that he's actually just asking him to consider things that are right there in front of him. This is empirically accessible. Week before last, we were in Arizona visiting family and spending some time with some Reformed Baptist friends from Gilbert, Arizona, and driving around Arizona in the late July when you get these monsoon storms is fantastic, because you're driving along and you can see 40 miles in every direction driving through the desert, and you can watch the storms gathering over mountains off in the distance and then making their way out across the desert. And the lightning bolts are not in Pennsylvania, in New Jersey, we get these great storms, but you got to hope that some trees are not blocking it, because we're just thick in the trees here. You're out there in the desert and you're watching the lightning, strike the ground, and there's nothing obscuring it, and there's
It's a nice story. It's a nice story. But what's with the weather stories with Calvinists? I don't know.
Know that you don't get that same urban glow that we get up here in the Northeast Corridor, and so everything just comes out with a kind of unusual, almost National Geographic-like brilliance. This is there for you to look at. These are things that you can see, that you can observe, that you can contemplate, and yet even here there is this kind of wonder, and Elihu's challenging Job with this. He's not asking him about subatomic particle physics here. He's just asking him about things that everyone sees when they go out and see a storm. And yet, even in this, there is this sense that the one behind all this, the one who brings this about, has a perfection of knowledge that is on display in these wonders of nature. He calls them the wonders of the.
So, yeah, that we also need to keep in mind that just because a text says God can control lightning, or God can control the weather, or he does control weather and does control lightning, that doesn't mean he controls all lightning, all weather, all the time. That's a very forced conclusion, and you're not going to find any Bible verses that talk about him controlling weather at all times, everywhere. And we had the podcast that we did. I like this podcast. I put a lot of effort into jazzing up the YouTube video on this podcast with pictures and references and stuff like that. It's a good podcast, but it's on, does God control the weather? No, he doesn't control the weather. He can control the weather. And there's biblical verses that describe him as controlling the weather, but you can't jump from there to claiming God controls all weather everywhere always, especially in the face of counterexamples that you could find. But go there, go to that podcast if you care about that subject, and listen to if God controls the weather. I don't think like the Houston hurricane. Oh, God controlled that. He just really didn't like Houston, and so he's smite Houston. Boom, gone. I don't think so. But so let's go on.
One perfect in knowledge. The nature is not an enigma to God. I would like to maybe even take this as an opportunity to say then that when we think about God's knowledge of the created order, we don't want to think about God as a kind of cosmic scientist, a sort of Einstein to the nth degree. What makes Einstein or Newton as physicists brilliant is that they contemplated and thought through the implications of what they were observing in nature and drawing certain law-like conclusions from that. That's not how God knows nature. God is not perfect in knowledge regarding nature because he has figured out how to connect all the dots, all the cause-effect relations that produce the phenomena that we observe. That's not how God knows nature. He knows nature not as some product of discovery.
What is this guy? Okay, so I think that his point is that God's knowledge of nature is like inherent in his being. what would open theists say? Well, God designed the world and creation, so of course he would understand how nature works. And this guy's strawman argument for the counter idea of how God would know nature is that he's a scientist doing experimentation to figure out how the nature works. So I don't know. Is there anyone who takes that belief? Maybe there is, but you got to provide examples if you're building this straw man, which you're going to contrast your own beliefs against this straw man.
That's how Newton and Einstein know nature. That's how you know nature. Okay, you just know it less than they did, but you know it the same way they did. You get your knowledge the same way they get theirs. They're just, doing things with it you're not. But God isn't like that, just more so. Okay,
And this proof text by Elihu, the great philosopher theologian, who is a great guy to quote. This guy, Elihu, agrees with my idea of God's perfection and knowledge because of this one little phrase, which we've already shown. The Bible doesn't use the word perfect in that way. That's being forced on this text.
He isn't just the cosmic ultimate observer of nature. His knowledge is perfect. It lacks nothing. It's perfect is the idea of complete. In Scripture, this is not so much talking about moral perfection at this point, but perfection in the sense of completeness, that which is without remainder, that which doesn't have a loose end, that which is not in any way, in any respect, lacking. God's perfection. God is the one who's perfect in knowledge, he says. Then with respect to God, now that's the big macro thing. Also with respect to God's knowledge of man, God is not lacking in knowledge. We might say, well, knowing nature, knowing the observable empirical phenomena of things, that's no big shakes. We can do that. We also find that God knows man perfectly, and there's a mystery to man that in a certain sense exceeds the mystery of the physical universe, in that the mystery of man.
I'm going to pause real quick. So this word perfection, the perfect, we remember he just described it, and we're going to end the podcast on this, but let's hear that description again.
He says. Then with respect to God, now that's the big macro.
And jump back.
He knows nature not as some product of discovery. That's how Newton and Einstein know nature. That's how you know nature. Okay, you just know it less than they did, but you know it the same way they did. You get your knowledge the same way they get theirs. They're just, doing things with it you're not. But God isn't like that, just more so. Okay? God isn't just the cosmic ultimate observer of nature. His knowledge is perfect. It lacks nothing. It's perfect is the idea of complete.
Okay, perfect is the idea of complete. It lacks nothing.
And in Scripture, this is not so much talking about moral perfection.
It's not talking about moral perfection.
At this point, but perfection in the sense of completeness. That
perfection in the sense of completeness. Okay, so in Job, this word is used multiple times, and it is used of Job. It literally is, Job 12:4. I am as one mocked of his neighbors, who calls upon God, and he answers him. The just, upright man is laughed to scorn. So he's saying, I am that perfect man. And Dolezal, he's saying, this word means perfect, pure, perfection. And he's bringing in a lot of assumptions that he doesn't get from the context. And it's just, he's desperate. He's desperate for a proof text. And it's not this phrase. This phrase has nothing to do with his theology. There's nothing in context that suggests that theology. And so it's just interesting how he uses these proof texts.
Which is without remainder. That which doesn't have a loose end.
Oh, there's no remainder in Job's perfection. There's no loose end in Job's perfection.
That which is not in any way, in any respect, lacking.
Job's perfection is not in any way lacking.
God's perfection. God is the one who's perfect in knowledge.
And Job is the one who's perfect.
He says. Then with respect to God, now that's the big macro thing. Also with respect to God's knowledge of man, God is not lacking in knowledge. We might say, well, knowing nature.
All right, we're going to have to cut off there. We're already at like an hour. So it's like, oh. But I like this guy. I like this podcast. I like this guy's sermons. It's interesting. He's straightforward. He says what he means. He's an honest guy. And if you really want to understand what open theists are up against, what this competing theology, what the competing metaphysics is, this is the guy to explain it. You're not going to hear these sermons about the nature and type and the mechanisms for God's omniscience. You're not going to hear that from James White or Matt Slick. You might hear snippets here and there, but they're not going to go in detail on the metaphysical basis for their beliefs. And all of their theology is based inherently on these Platonistic ideas of perfection, how this perfection must work for God to be God. And then you see them, like Dolezal does, just desperately grasping for proof text. They're desperate for the Bible to confirm what they've already decided in their own head, even though there's nothing in the context to support that. And all their assumptions on the words and phrases being used, it's a double standard, because those phrases and words are used about human beings throughout the Bible. And it's used like God knows all things. Well, Jesus knew all things, but there's a date and time that he didn't know. So maybe your understanding of knows all things is forced on the text. It's not being used how the author was using that. So you got a little bit more work to do to show your citations, show your thought process, and not make jumps in logic. But I like this guy. We might continue on a later podcast. We'll definitely be quoting him, especially to other Calvinists who don't understand their own metaphysics. So this guy's great, very quotable, very quotable. But all right, any questions or comments, send that to godisopenquestions@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.